I don't know why I agreed to do it. Spend 24 hours in an abandoned asylum. Maybe it was the promise of a thrill, the adrenaline rush, or just plain stupidity. The old Brookside Asylum had been shut down for over 50 years, condemned and left to rot on the edge of town. Everyone knew the stories, patients who vanished without a trace, experiments that went horribly wrong, and the screams that locals swore they could still hear at night. But I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not yet. I arrived just before noon, the sun hanging low in a grey, overcast sky. The building loomed before me, its massive stone walls cracked and crumbling, windows shattered and dark. The iron gates were rusted shut, but I managed to squeeze through a gap in the bars. The grounds were overgrown with weeds and brambles, the trees bare and twisted like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. I pushed open the heavy front door, the hinges squealing in protest. The smell hit me first, a mix of mold, decay, and something sour, like old sweat. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, the beam barely penetrating the thick gloom. The lobby was vast, with peeling paint and crumbling plaster. An old reception desk sat in the middle, covered in a thick layer of dust. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the silence was almost deafening. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls as I made my way deeper into the asylum. I felt a chill creep down my spine, but I pushed it aside. It was just an old building, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. I passed by old, rusted gurneys and broken wheelchairs, the metal creaking softly in the still air. The walls were lined with faded posters, reminders of a time when this place had been filled with life, or something like it. I moved further in, my footsteps growing softer on the cracked linoleum floor. I reached the central stairwell, and I looked up to see floors upon floors disappearing into darkness. I decided to start with the basement. If the stories were true, that was where the worst of it had happened. I found the stairwell leading down, the metal steps cold and slick with moisture. As I descended, the air grew colder, and a soft whispering seemed to drift through the halls, too faint to make out. I tried to ignore it, but my skin prickled with fear. The basement was pitch black, the darkness so thick it seemed to press in on me from all sides. I shone my flashlight around, revealing a long hallway lined with doors, most of them hanging open or lying on the floor. I stepped inside and moved slowly, my breath echoing loudly in the narrow corridor. Then I heard it, the sound of something dragging across the floor, a slow, deliberate scraping noise that sent a jolt of fear through me. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just an empty hallway and shadows. The sound continued, closer now, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence, and then a faint, soft whisper. "Help me." My heart leapt into my throat. The voice was weak, desperate, coming from somewhere down the hall. I took a step forward, then another, my hands trembling as I held the flashlight. The whisper grew louder, more urgent. I reached a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The nameplate on the door was scratched out, unreadable. I pushed it open with a creak and shone the light inside. It was a small room, bare except for a single bed, its sheets torn and stained. And in the corner I saw a figure, a woman, huddled on the floor, her hair tangled and matted, her face hidden in her hands. I gasped and took a step back. Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She just sat there, rocking back and forth, muttering softly to herself. I took a cautious step forward, shining the flashlight on her. "Do you need help?" She stopped rocking, her hands slowly lowering from her face. Her eyes, they were empty, hollow, like black pits staring right through me. Her mouth twisted into a smile, too wide, too unnatural. "Stay with us," she whispered. A cold wind blew through the room, even though the windows were sealed shut. The door slammed behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my flashlight flickering, and when I turned back, she was gone. The room was empty, the bed untouched. I felt panic rising in my chest. I needed to get out of the basement. I backed out of the room and into the hallway, my heart pounding. I could hear the whispering again, louder now, more frantic, echoing off the walls. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the dark. I reached the stairs and hurried up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I emerged back into the main hall, and the air felt heavier, colder. The light from the windows was fading fast, and the shadows seemed to stretch and reach for me. I checked my watch. It was barely past 2 p.m., but it felt like hours had passed. I decided to head to the upper floors. I didn't want to stay in the dark halls any longer than I had to. I found another stairwell and began to climb, the steps creaking under my weight. The higher I went, the colder it got, my breath visible in the freezing air. I reached the second floor and stepped into a hallway, lined with patient rooms. The doors were mostly closed, some with chains hanging from the handles. I heard faint whispers again, coming from all directions now, overlapping, mixing together. I strained to hear the words, but they were too faint, too distorted. Then I heard it, a loud thud, like something heavy being thrown against a door. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight beam shaking. Another thud, closer this time, and a door at the end of the hall shuddered violently, as if something or someone was pounding on it from the other side. I moved closer, my hand gripping the flashlight tight. The door shook again, and I heard a low growl, deep and menacing. I reached out to touch the doorknob, but before I could, the door flew open with a crash, slamming into the wall. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. The room beyond was empty, just a single chair overturned on the floor. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and I spun around. The hallway was empty, but I felt something there, something watching me. I heard a soft giggle, a child's laugh, and then a low whisper, right in my ear. "You shouldn't have come." I bolted, running down the hall, my footsteps loud and frantic. I reached the end of the hall and turned a corner, only to come face to face with a figure, a tall, gaunt man in a tattered hospital gown, his face pale and twisted, his eyes wide with madness. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and bony, his nails cracked and yellow. "Stay with us," he rasped, his voice like sandpaper against stone. I backed away, my heart racing, and turned to run, but he was there too, in front of me, blocking my path. I turned again, and there he was, over and over, appearing at every corner, every doorway, his eyes fixed on me, that twisted smile never fading. I felt trapped, the walls closing in on me, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, filling my head. I ran blindly, turning corners, climbing stairs, moving deeper into the asylum, the whispers and laughter following me. I reached the top floor and burst through a door, finding myself in a large open room. It was the old ward, where they kept the most disturbed patients. The room was filled with old, rusted beds, their springs creaking in the wind that seemed to blow from nowhere. I felt a presence behind me, and I turned slowly. The room seemed to shift and distort, the walls closing in, the shadows growing longer. I saw them then, the patients, dozens of them, their forms barely visible in the darkness, moving slowly toward me, their eyes empty, their hands reaching out. I backed up, my flashlight flickering wildly, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers grew louder, deafening now, filling my ears, my mind, until I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, and the lights went out completely. Darkness enveloped me, thick and heavy, and I felt hands, cold and clammy, grab me from all sides, pulling me down, down into the darkness, into the cold, into the madness. And then everything went silent. I woke up outside the asylum, the cold grey light of dawn just breaking over the horizon. My head was pounding, my body aching. I had no memory of how I got there, only fragments, flashes of faces, whispers and shadows. I stumbled to my feet, my breath visible in the chilly morning air. I looked back at the asylum, its windows dark and empty, its doors closed tight. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I don't know what happened in there, not really, but I know one thing. I'll never go back. Whatever is inside the Brookside Asylum, it doesn't want. Whatever is inside Brookside Asylum, it doesn't want to be disturbed. I staggered back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I could barely keep my thoughts straight. I needed to get out of there, away from the building, away from whatever it was that I had awakened. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a face peering back at me from the back seat. There was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out behind me. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept seeing flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting across the fields, shapes that seemed to melt away whenever I tried to focus on them. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was still coming down from the fear, that my imagination was working overtime after everything I'd been through. But deep down I knew better. I knew that whatever had been in that asylum wasn't confined to its walls. It had followed me out. When I finally got home, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt. I felt safer, but only slightly. I could still feel it, a cold presence, just beyond my sight. I took a deep breath and headed for the shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the fear, the grime, the cold that had seeped into my bones. But the water didn't help. I stood under the scalding stream, my skin turning red. But the chill wouldn't leave. I closed my eyes, letting the water run over my face. And that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, almost drowned out by the sound of the shower. "You can't leave." My eyes snapped open, and I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty bathroom, steam clinging to the mirror. I stepped out of the shower, grabbing a towel, my heart hammering in my chest. I wiped the fog from the mirror, and for a split second I saw a face behind me. A pale, twisted face with wide, staring eyes. I turned around, but again nothing. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't think. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made my skin crawl. I tried to distract myself, as I tried to watch TV, read a book, but nothing helped. I felt like I was being watched all the time, eyes boring into me from every corner of the room. As night fell, the feeling grew stronger. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, deeper. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. The whispers began again, soft at first, barely audible, but slowly growing louder. They were all around me, coming from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, taunting, mocking. I tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, more insistent. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head. And then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty rooms. I stood up, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, holding it out in front of me. "I'm warning you," I yelled, but there was no response, just the sound of those footsteps moving closer and closer. The lights flickered, and I heard the soft giggle again, that child's laugh from the asylum. I felt a rush of cold air, and the lights went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. I backed up against the wall, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, overlapping, surrounding me. I felt something brush against my arm, cold and clammy, like a hand. I swung the knife wildly, but it cut through empty air. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting. Then a voice whispered, right in my ear, "We're here." I screamed and the lights flickered back on. I was alone in the apartment, the knife still clutched in my hand. The whispers had stopped, and the air felt warmer, lighter. I stumbled to the door, throwing it open and rushing outside. I couldn't stay there, not another second. I ran to my car and drove, not knowing where I was going, just needing to be away, as far away as possible. I ended up at a motel on the edge of town, a dingy little place with flickering neon lights. I paid for a room and locked myself inside, feeling a little safer with 4 walls between me and whatever was out there. But as the night dragged on, the feeling of dread grew stronger. I kept seeing shadows moving outside the window, flickers of light, shapes darting back and forth. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I heard the whispering, faint and distant, but getting closer. Around 3 a.m., the TV turned on by itself, the screen filled with static. I reached for the remote, but it wasn't on the nightstand where I had left it. I got up and turned the TV off manually, my hands trembling. I turned back to the bed and froze. There on the pillow was the remote, and next to it, a small carved wooden toy, a horse, just like the one I had seen in the asylum. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You can't leave." I turned, but there was no one there, just the dark, empty room. I backed up, my eyes wide with fear, and that's when I saw them, reflected in the mirror on the opposite wall. Dozens of faces, twisted and gaunt, staring at me, their mouths moving in silent whispers. I backed up against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The light flickered again, and the faces grew closer, their eyes wide, mouths twisted in unnatural grins. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, filling the room. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and running into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until my legs gave out, and I collapsed on the side of the road. I don't know how long I lay there, shivering, crying, until I finally looked up. The sun was just starting to rise, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. I could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, but growing quieter, fading with the light. I made it back to my car and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from that place, from the town, from the asylum. I don't know what I saw, what I heard. I don't want to know. I just know I can't go back. I can't ever go back. Because they're still there, in the shadows, in the corners of my mind, waiting, whispering, calling me back to the asylum. And I know deep down that one day They'll find me again.
Гражданочка, который чай? Спасибо.